So yeah, we're going to talk about multi-platform proof of concepts. Just quick intro to me if you don't know who I am. My name is Russell Wolf. I'm a multi-platform engineer here at Touchlab. I started in February, but I've been working with multi-platform stuff for about 2 years, since pretty much for as long as you could build multi-platform to native. Today we're gonna talk about like a couple notes on getting started and what some of the kind of complexities of getting started are. Talk through kind of some of the philosophy behind KaMP Kit and kind of a brief overview of what's in it, and talk a little bit about what the experience is like of kind of going from that sample to integrating into your real products. Getting started. Kotlin Multiplatform has been around for a couple of years now, and a lot of things have kind of like it's been experimental for a while. And a lot of things have kind of been evolving pretty rapidly in that time, and it's as it's been stabilizing. It's hard sometimes to find like what's the most up-to-date best practice. So you come across a lot of like documentation and blog posts, like even some things sometimes on the official Kotlin pages that are out of date. And it's not always obvious why. So that's just kind of like a stumbling block that people run into sometimes. Another one that's come up in some of the questions in the last couple of days is libraries. So we're used to, especially if we're coming kind of from an Android background, like there's certain dependencies and stuff that we're used to working with that don't, like for the most part, don't exist or don't work in the same way in multi-platform. So what is the multi-platform library ecosystem like, and like what is available to use? Another complexity is the configuration. So Kotlin Multiplatform uses a new Gradle plugin that has a fair amount of complexity to it. Like there's slightly different configuration for each of the different platforms, depending on if you're doing JVM or Android or iOS or JS. And it can kind of take a little bit to wrap your head around how that all works and what the best way to set things up is and how to get it kind of working the way you want. Then on top of that, there's linking that Gradle configuration to Xcode into your iOS project and doing that in a smooth way. And then lastly, the threading model in Kotlin native behaves differently than what you're used to on the JVM. And that's often a stumbling block for new people trying out this technology. It's very possible to kind of like the rules are not that complicated. Like it's very possible to kind of learn your way around it and get used to it. But when you're used to the JVM, things that like you're used to like being able to do without thinking sometimes don't work in the same way. So that's often a point of confusion. So in response to all of these things, we put together KaMP Kit, which includes both some kind of documentation on best practices as well as a sample project that kind of has everything already configured out of the box. So the idea is once you have all of the developer tools installed, you should be able to pull down the project and build it right away and be able to kind of like get started experimenting pretty quickly so that you can focus on like solving the problems that are interesting to our use case rather than just trying to figure out how to get Kotlin Multiplatform working. So what the sample project is just a single screen application on Android and iOS that calls an API that displays a list of dog breeds, and you can favorite the ones that you like. And it's kind of complex enough that it's doing some interesting things, but it's simple enough that you can kind of strip things out and map it more towards your actual use case. And we've tried to tune it towards what things will look like as like when kind of your app is closer to production versus kind of exactly what things look like now. So we're using kind of a couple preview versions of some dependencies and things so that you can kind of get ahead of the curve and have things kind of ready for when that stuff is there. So the basic structure is it makes web calls using JetBrains KTOR framework. And we're using the multi-threaded coroutines branch, which is a kind of preview release of the coroutines dependency that KTOR does, like out of the box isn't well configured for, but we have a workaround in place so that you don't have to worry about that inconsistency. We then persist the data from that call using SQLite to save things to database. And there's also multi-platform settings configuration for saving simple key value data. On top of that, we have a separate UI on each platform because as we've talked a little bit about in the last couple of days, like you don't always want to share 100% of your code. And UI in particular is something that's often much easier done in the kind of separate platform setup. Wrapping things together, we have a dependency injection setup using a preview release of the next version of Coin that has that is multi-thread safe. There's also unit test configuration and some deployment configuration. So we use CocoaPods to deploy the iOS code to Xcode. And we're using a fork the CocoaPods plugin that lets Xcode debugging work in there. So we talked a little bit yesterday about debugging stuff because a question came up. So Touchlab has our Xcode debugging plugin, or Kotlin debugging plugin for Xcode, and that works in the KaMP Kit configuration. So once you kind of have that all there and understand it and have it building and working, you can start experimenting with it, start kind of adapting it to your own use cases. And we've found it like pretty useful internally at Touchlab, having this template project that's right there and ready to spin up. So like we've had a couple different questions from clients where they say like, is this sort of thing possible to do a multi-platform? And we can fairly quickly like clone KaMP Kit, like make the relevant changes and kind of like have working prototype pretty quickly. So one example of that was there was a question around like, how can I split my database definitions across different modules? And we could just, and we just kind of made a branch and had a proof of concept there pretty quickly. We were also experimenting with like, what does it look like to expose or to integrate your coroutines on the Kotlin side with RX Swift on the iOS side. And that was another one where like we had integration both with KaMP Kit and in the client's code as well. And then from there, once you kind of like have your proof of concept stuff ready, you can start to think about how to copy that configuration into your own project. So for the same client, we were basically building kind of one vertically integrated feature where we had database through to UI. And we were able to leverage the existing KaMP configuration to like fairly quickly get that module sort of spun up and ready. So obviously doing like getting all the kind of configuration in place on the production side is going to be harder than when you're making proof of concept. But having something there that kind of has it all out of the box is still very helpful. So I'm going to pass it over quickly to Kevin, who is going to talk about a little bit about another example of productionizing stuff with one of our other clients.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, as Russell was saying, the idea behind KaMP Kit was, we're seeing a lot of disparate information. That was actually caught me off guard because I was like, someone wrote back to me at Slack who was like really upset about how all the docs and all the tutorials are all over the place. And we wanted sort of just do this here and we'll get you up and running as soon as possible. But in the context of an evaluation, especially if you're selling this into your org, there are folks who've made the determination that it's not going to be persuasive unless we show it working with our production apps, which makes logical sense. The problem is, of course, like any production scale configuration of any platform tends to be complex and often brittle and obscure unless you're an engineer who works on the thing in the production context. And what happens a lot is, you know, Android engineers looking at KMP, we've seen them try to integrate Kotlin into a production iOS build, not having any experience doing the iOS build. So that tends to be what you'd say, call a risky procedure at best. But yeah, we did that with GoPro, which was interesting because they really were trying to do a lot of other shared code with C++ and some relatively less common situations. So we actually spent some time with them because the configuration got complex, and you just like, it is trying to fit in a proof of concept within a time window that may not be feasible. So it is important if you're going to try to do this with, you know, in the context of an iOS build. It's important to recruit somebody from the iOS team, I think, or just because you want to have people's minds open to the eventual end of this proof of concept, which is some other language involved in your build system, but also production build systems tend to be complex. Otherwise, it'll probably be pretty difficult, especially if you're from not an iOS build background, to understand what's a linker error, to understand, you know, how the simulator build works versus whatever. And quite literally, in the case of GoPro, you know, we had to get on sort of a screen share to help debug some of the config stuff because it was fairly complex. So I guess it's just, you know, there's not a lot of useful help there other than integrating with production builds can be tricky, which is generally like sane advice in any context. Yeah, reach out on this Kotlin Slack and reach out to us if you're trying to do that, because we are definitely in the business of trying to make people be successful.
Sure. Yeah. And on that subject, we can pass things over to any questions that you guys have. There's a couple quick links again to the KaMP Kit repo as well.
Watch. So the question, watch OS. It was like as you were asking for questions. Not until you asked the question, but that's actually, I think, a reasonable. I don't know how the dog breed feature would work with watchOS, but
yeah, like watchOS support on the in the shard code is fairly easy to add. You can like the one complication you can run into sometimes is it's you'll have like a 32-bit integer by default versus 64-bit.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's
but yeah,
like,
I think we'll
like the UI side of it would be the hard part.
I mean, we'll add that to the discussion list internally.
Yeah. So there's another question, and I think it's a good one around how to filter information that's out there on KMP. So we can certainly take a stab at that one. And if anyone in the meeting here has done KaMP Kit and has any comments on how they've used it at their organization, please drop those in as well. We'd love to kind of hear from everyone. But Kevin, do you want to take that question?
Yeah. So it's not like unique to Kotlin that the documentation is where it's at, right? Like it is the, a symptom of developer ecosystems that have recently evolved rapidly, right? So if you go to Google and search getting started with Kotlin Multiplatform, you'll get stuff that's old, and it will often not even compile with most recent things, much less be good advice. So JetBrains is like super aware of this. We've been talking about it a lot with them. They're investing quite a bit of resources into releasing a bunch of new stuff soon. We're working with them directly. There was an announcement. So you'll probably be reading about concurrency from me, right? Like just to help explain it. But how do you start now is like, the problem isn't so much like, once you kind of understand the ecosystem better, finding what's good versus what's not really good becomes a skill you learn. And I think that's true in any ecosystem. The problem is getting started from scratch tends to be a heavy lift. And if you start from things that don't work, you get discouraged. So that's why at the beginning of the KaMP Kit thing, we're like, if you start this, don't look up anything else. If you get stuck, go to the Slack and ask. Because once you start Googling other stuff, you get lost. Once you get this running, then go read the blog posts and go read what people disagree with us and do whatever you want. That's fine. Once you have something running, because then you can change it, see that it's not running anymore, revert it back, and then take a different path, right? And or absolutely go to the Kotlin Slack and go to the multi-platform channel. And it's still a small enough ecosystem that even the JetBrains engineers will directly answer questions, right? So that's where you go get help. If you're not in the Kotlin Slack and you're just kind of Googling, I think it's going to be difficult because Google's automatic search engine does not know what is the correct information. That is for sure.
Yeah, and if you want to join that Slack, that's the link that's up there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's a KaMP Kit Spark channel as well.
Yeah, right. So I would go in there if you're going to try this out, like legitimately, like give it a serious try. Pop in there. There's some of us answering questions. There's other folks helping out too. So you'll definitely, assuming your machine is got recent versions of OS on there and tools, so you'll be able to build this and get it to work. Beyond that, I got no promises, but you know, that's the luck.
Yeah, and that Slack channel also has the historical conversations and questions that people have asked. So if there's a similar question that someone had before, you can definitely reference it to get the answer. So that's the great part about that resource that Russell has up there. Any other questions, comments? We've got a couple. I think we've got a couple minutes. We've got a question around how much time did we spend on KaMP Kit?
I can speak that better than I can because I wasn't around when most of it was developed.
What was it? Oh, how much time? There's several hundred commits. So I don't know how to estimate a time backfill from that. Why were there so many commits? I kind of talk about this in the talks I've given. Some of it's because other members of the team are very verbose committers, and they'll have commits for very small changes. I tend to be more of the kind you don't want, who gives you a huge chunk of changes in one. But also because a lot of it was, we spent a lot of time, as much time removing things and simplifying things as we did adding features. And there was a lot of feedback, and we worked with people to get feedback on like, hey, this is confusing, this is unnecessary, please clarify this, that kind of stuff. So a lot of it was kind of refining it. Like, you know, we want to be clear, is this just another template project? Like, yeah, on some level, but it is a very, very particular template project because we're trying to add just enough that you can get started, but nothing more so you don't get confused. And that's where all the bulk of the work actually went. Good question, John O'Reilly. How's it going? Good to see you. KTOR, when is KTOR going to work with multi-threaded coroutines? I don't know. I am quite literally, if I showed you my screen, when I Alt-Tab over to Terminal, I'm trying to get KTOR building locally to see if I can have a version of the iOS that will at least function in the interim, while we're also trying to like pressure JetBrains into getting a version working, because that is, it's great that they have the multi-threaded coroutines like alternate universe library that's out there, but the fact that you can't use it with KTOR is a major blocker. So I don't know. I will go on record as saying I'm disappointed that it's not there yet, but we're trying to work on at least a workaround.
Yeah, and it is possible to kind of configure a way around it by kind of keeping your KTOR stuff in a separate scope, but it's a pain, and you don't really want that in the long term.
You can keep it in a separate code, but it's scope, but it definitely like the whole like structured concurrency thing.
Yeah.
Like it gets blown out if you can't structure your concurrency. So. Yeah, which channel, multi-platform or coroutines, to ask a question about Kotlin native and coroutines? I don't have a good answer. I often feel like the desire to cross-post, and that upsets everybody in the Slack thing. So I, I don't have a good answer. I would probably post in Kotlin native about multi-threaded specific coroutines. And if you don't get the answer you want, you can either post it back in coroutines, or if you're feeling particularly ambitious, just at Roman in there, and then see if he gets, bugged enough to reply directly. Say,